All right, guys, big things going on with our neighbors to the north. Let me start with the headline from this morning, and then I'll sort of go back and walk us through how we got there. So the truckers had closed down a number of bridges. Those bridges have been reopened, I believe, late last night. Finally, the big one, the Ambassador Bridge, was reopened. All right, let me show you how we got here. Let's throw this first tear sheet up on the screen. So truckers' bridge blockade forces shutdowns at auto plants, so they hit them right where it hurts in the capitalism. Apparently, you have the Ambassador Bridge, which is the busiest U.S.-Canadian border crossing, carrying 25% of all trade between the two countries, had been shut down by the trucker Convoy. You had a couple of other bridges also shut down. And Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer really freaked out about this. Understandably, I get why, because you had production lines from multiple automakers shut down because they could not get, the supplies that they needed to continue production. This, as we know, continues on top of, we already had a lot of issues with car production and shutdowns because of the supply chain crises. So when you had these bridges shut, this immediately created problems for these auto plants. The quote from Governor Whitmer was, "It's hitting paychecks and production lines. That is unacceptable." So that's Act 1, bridges shut down. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer is very upset. Auto plants are shutting down. Step 2, let's put this next piece up on the screen. Joe Biden puts in a call to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. And of course, the language here is very diplomatic and very sort of nice. But it seems that in no uncertain terms, the President of the United States was like, you got to get this shit handled. This is hurting us now.
Yes.
Like, you need to take care of this.
Yes. The trucker's mistake was screwing with our commerce.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. When it came to our profit-making abilities, that was where we had to draw the line. What Biden said is the Prime Minister promised swift action in enforcing the law. Okay, so Biden puts in the call to Trudeau. That was on Saturday. Then let's put this next piece up on the screen. You start to have these, calls coming from liberal media outlets that maybe are a little inconsistent with the reaction to past calls for law enforcement crackdowns. And this says, as protests stretch on in Canada and truckers block supply chains with the U.S., some Canadians are asking, why hasn't Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordered the authorities to quash the demonstrations? That subhead down below says, why hasn't Trudeau ordered the police or the army to quash the protests, Saagar?
Krystal, that's actually from the news desk. That's the most remarkable part. That's not even an op-ed.
It's not opinion.
Yeah, I remember a certain Tom Cotton op-ed that was pulled off and everybody freaked out and all of that. But whenever it comes to this one, then, principles suddenly go out the window.
Let me say, I was fine with them publishing the Tom Cotton op-ed. I was very much opposed to the content of the Tom Cotton op-ed because I think we should be extraordinarily reluctant to call in the military onto civilian streets for any purposes. I thought that with George Floyd. I thought that after January 6th. And I think it here in terms of what's going on in Canada with our neighbors to the north, although they have their own different standards and norms there. Actually, I think they are even more reluctant than we are to call in the military to handle what is ultimately, what is it? It's a peaceful protest. This is not particularly my cause. I actually am sympathetic to a lot of aspects of it, but this isn't particularly my cause. My principle here is that we have to support protest and freedom of expression. And you see a lot of hypocrisy all the way around here in terms of, you've got liberal media suddenly like, hey, where's the army? Let's call in the military. Now, the way that they framed it was like, some Canadians are asking, where's the military? So you have that on that side. On the other side, of course, Fox News, when it was the George Floyd protesters, they were all ready to send in the military.
And now they're all pro-civil.
Now they're all, now they're freedom fighters and protest is noble. I mean, these are the same people who push for like anti-protest laws in a whole bunch of states. But the next thing that happens, this is incredible again, in terms of liberals being pretty hypocritical here. This is a woman who's a security analyst for CNN.
Yes.
Juliet Kayyem, I don't know. The Convoy protest, applauded by right-wing media as a freedom protest, is an economic and security issue now. The Ambassador Bridge link constitutes 28% of annual trade movement. Slash the tires, empty gas tanks, arrest the drivers, and move the trucks. Now, The one problem, so first of all, that's obviously extraordinarily aggressive. The other thing is that a lot of the drivers themselves were removing their tires and bleeding their brake lines so that you can't move the truck. So it seems to me like slashing the tires and emptying the gas tanks. First of all, you're talking about vandalism and theft. But second of all, that's like sort of helping their cause and making the trucks less movable.
Also, do you know what it means to slash an 18-wheeler tire? You're going to die, okay? This is something that everybody knows about truck tires. But look, the major thing is that the Canadian government, definitely at the behest of the US government, is very much going hardcore against these truckers. You know, we covered the GoFundMe crisis, in which GoFundMe they almost raised $10 million for the truckers. GoFundMe basically says at the behest of the Canadian police, no, we're going to be canceling this. And actually in the beginning, not even saying that they would return the money as they have in the past, saying, oh, well, we're going to give it to our chosen charities, basically confiscating people's money. After protests, they eventually ended up returning it. Well, there was another website called Give, Send, Go that had been raising money for these truckers. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. And lo and behold, by Canadian law, this is from Global News, Ontario has frozen those funds from Give, Send, Go's Trucker Convoy fundraiser. Once again, millions and millions of dollars donated through the online fundraising platform. And actually some breaking news this morning, Krystal, that I just sent over to you, which is that unfortunately Give, Send, Go, their servers were hacked, and it seems that people are downloading the donor list of the actual donors to the cause itself. There's a man named Dean Blundell who's actually been bragging about this over on Twitter, and says a lot of these people are basically saying, I have the entire list, just checking with legal, nerds rule, essentially implying that he's going to be doxing some of the people who are donor lists or making it available by public. This is a total weaponization of online fundraising. I mean, I've said this in the past, you know, Black Lives Matter, as we see right now, currently in financial disarray over the millions of dollars that were saved with a lot of questions. I still support the ability of Give, Send, Go and of GoFundMe, any of these places, in order to raise money for a cause you believe in. That is between the citizen and the cause itself. If you get duped, that's on you. And that's the same thing whenever it comes to this. I mean, you are seeing a full-scale operation by the Canadian government, once again, very much at the encouragement of the United States government in order to quash this. I think it's also funny, too, that the Canadians no longer say this is like some Russian-sponsored trucker convoy. They're blaming us. They're like, basically, because our media is free and we actually have a First Amendment and freedom of speech, that we have a large amount of support here, probably, frankly, more domestic support here than they actually do in Canada for the trucker convoy. That being said, a lot of our money is flowing into the fundraising dollars for these Canadian truckers, and the Trudeau is like, this is American money, an American cause, flooding our politics, all of that. I don't have a lot of sympathy for that. I think it's kind of funny.
It's funny because I listened to that podcast where they brought on this woman who's like a terrorism financing expert.
Oh yeah, you're the one who found this. This is crazy.
To talk about this, and it was really funny to listen to because it was the same language that they used during Russiagate of like, you know, malign foreign interference and that sort of like sort of language. But yeah, they're talking about us, which look, I get it. I mean, I wouldn't pretend like, you know, we're like the big brother who's sort of throwing our weight around and funneling these millions into this protest, but that's ultimately the way the world works, and there's nothing illegal or like particularly, you know, overtly nefarious about that. They were thinking about having a government hearing into the source of the financing. There's all kinds of really unsupported allegations that are being floated about where the money is coming from and all of these pieces that, again, I mean, listen, if it is coming from some like nefarious place or, you know, like dirty money somehow, then you have to show us the allegations of that. You can't just sort of make that up out of thin air. You know, my primary feeling about all of this is jealousy that we don't have on the left protest. This is a very effective and smart protest.
It's spreading across the country, across the world. Sorry, there's one in Jerusalem this morning. That's right. Yeah.
And actually New Zealand, I was just reading this morning, the New Zealand, are they president or prime minister there? Anyway, whoever's in charge in New Zealand was also making the allegations that their protests that they're having on their soil now are foreign inspired and sort of like astroturf from the US and from Canada, saying that there are Trump flags at the protest, that there are Canadian flags at the protest. But clearly they have inspired people towards these sorts of tactics around the world. Clearly, there is some level in every country of organic backlash to what has now been years of pandemic restrictions.
Actually, officially 2 years. We did our first coronavirus segment on Rising about 2 years ago today.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's not particularly my cause. I'm extremely envious of the tactics in the organization. There was a New York Times article about like how effectively organized this was, that they had people who were providing supplies, and you had former law enforcement and former military who were involved in the leadership, who understood logistics and understood the planning. And so, the tactic of shutting down supply chains at a time when there's already a lot of pressure there is a really smart, yes, militant tactic. But that's what the most effective, economic boycott, this has a long and at times proud history. You have to make people in power feel some sort of pain because they don't care if you're just like in your designated free speech zone saying whatever. You have to make life uncomfortable for people in power. And that's what they have effectively done here. So again, look, it's not particularly my cause. I support their right to peaceful protest. And I am only envious that the left hasn't had this level of sort of like organization and focus on disrupting supply chains and these types of tactics that could ultimately have an effect.
But we'll see how long of an effect it has. Unfortunately, let's put this up there on the screen, which is the Canadian police have actually been clearing the bridge, the Ambassador Bridge, after a week of disruption. The Ambassador Bridge being where hundreds of millions of dollars of parts and other things were being held up there. Gretchen Whitmer and the president and others had really been focusing on that. So look, we'll see. I mean, my hope is that this will lead to at least some pressure within Canada domestically, at least to try and lessen some of the most stringent stuff there. I mean, you can see Quebec and others, like you can't even buy groceries if you're not vaccinated. I think that's nuts. Like, I don't support that. This is the domestic West. We don't run that way. That being said, look, it's your own country. You guys decide. If the majority of the population, so be it. I'm not saying we should liberate the Canadians, although I'm sure we'd be I'm just gonna. I'm sure we'd be greeted as liberators.
Yeah, that's the way that always works out.
I think we should stay out of Canada, their weird French place in Quebec in particular. But this is something where it's a beautiful place. Poutine is weird and gross, though. I will say that. What I generally think is that with all this, it's not, as you said originally, even about those trucker vaccine mandates.
Yeah.
It's become an international cause for restriction. People are fed up. And on that, I'm get behind it 100%. I'm not necessarily, even the back, of course I'm against the mandates, but as you said, there was some very troubling, like truly anti-vax sentiment within the convoy. But at this point, the conflagration, Israel, for example, everybody in Israel has to be vaccinated anyway. You think they're lining up around vaccine mandates? No, they're sick of living under restrictions, just like many of us. In fact, here in the United States, luckily, we're more free than most people. But New Zealand, and Australia and Israel, they have been put through the ringer in a way that is unparalleled outside of Asia, like Hong Kong, essentially, in terms of what their restrictions look like. And I don't think human beings should have to live that way in a civilized society. So from that point, I think it's a good cause. Here's
the other piece is, and I think Taibbi had a good piece about this whole thing. He had a good write-up that I encourage you all to check out on his Substack. The treatment, both from the media and from Trudeau, has been to sort of dismiss the demands and the concerns of this group as like beyond the pale.
Yes.
And I just, I don't agree with that. Even if you totally disagree with, their view on mandates, their view on mask policies or any of those things, I think we should all agree that these are legitimate places of public debate and discussion. And so the attempt to just sort of like demonize them, push them out of the public square, say that this is basically, off the table or beyond the pale in terms of even having a debate. I really object to that. I mean, the one place that I think the narrative from the right is kind of silly is making this out like this movement is representative of all working class people, or this is some working class movement. Like, that's not true. It's not true in Canada in terms of, the actual views of working class people and who's vaccinated and who's not. It's not even representative of all truckers. Mm-hmm. But the part that I think we should be most concerned about here is, number one, this instinct towards like pushing people out of the public square rather than engagement, I think is very damaging to democracy. I also think that the piece of the fundraising platforms taking it upon themselves to pull the funds or being pressured by government to pull the funds. Like, that's another direction that we should see as very troubling in the same lens as, you know, the type of censorship that we've been tracking them pushing Spotify to do and pushing these other big tech platforms to say basically like these views are sanctioned and these ones aren't. You don't want to hand these people more power than they already have. They have so much power, and so much of liberal energy these days is dedicated towards like begging people who already have a lot of power to claim even more power about who has a legitimate voice, who has legitimate grievance, and who doesn't ultimately. So to me, those are the pieces that are really important. In terms of the impact ultimately of these protests, because as you point out, after Biden made the call and was like, listen, capitalism is priority number one, so you better get this figured out. The bridges are reopened. There are continuing protests in Ottawa that are significant, although I guess there has been some engagement. I was reading this morning with the folks that are there trying to limit where the truckers are to, you know, certain areas so they're not as disruptive in residential neighborhoods. So there's been a little bit of give and take and dialogue there. But this has not been good for Trudeau. Trudeau already has low approval ratings. His government is not particularly popular. And so while I don't know that they're going to get any of their specific demands immediately met in the short term, because I don't think that Trudeau or the rest of the government wants to be seen as sort of like capitulating in the face of this, they're going to want to avoid this kind of conflagration in the future.
I agree.
So I think it acts as more of a check on potential future actions, and in that way is probably very effective, not just in Canada, but other places around the world that are going, I don't want this to happen here, and to have such a political blow up here as well. So I think even if they don't win on their specific, you know, vaccine cross-border mandate issues or, you know, local pandemic restrictions, I do think it serves as a kind of check on future actions and restrictions that could be contemplated down the road.
I think that's well said. And you're correct, which is this has been a major embarrassment to Trudeau across the world in his relations with the United States. It's also given and shown us some of the cleavages in Canadians and Western society broadly, and the larger inspiration now in Jerusalem and New Zealand, perhaps elsewhere, is going to serve as kind of a global conflagration possibly against these things. I don't want to overstate it. I have no idea how big those things will be, but as you said, more what it is it's a democratic check in the future against people in power saying, all right, so let's say there's another Omicron. I don't think a lot of these restrictions can come back simply because of what's happened here.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.